When I was young, and some were laughing because they're older than me, and some are laughing because they can't relate. And that's okay. That's a good place to be, by the way, somewhere in the middle. And this will show my age. I remember growing up listening to my parents' RCA LPs.
Oh, yeah.
Harry Belafonte. Remember Harry Belafonte? He had that smooth, kind of raspy but smooth kind of style of singing. One of my favorites. John will appreciate this, I'm sure, because I think this is kind of like to set the stage for some country songs. I'm not going to get into any jokes with that one. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza. Remember that one? And it went cyclical, right? I can sing the whole thing, much to my wife's shame and embarrassment. And every once in a while, I'll still break out in song at home, hopefully when nobody's listening. And I'll go through the whole thing. You know, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, there's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Well, fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry. Fix it. What's the next thing? With what shall I fix it? Right? With straw, dear Henry. The straw is too long. Well, cut it, dear Henry. With what shall I cut it? With an axe, dear Henry. The axe is too dull, right? And it goes on and on and on. And eventually, it gets back to, well, how are you going to sharpen the axe? Well, you sharpen the axe with the stone. The stone is too dry. What do? You wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. And you can hear the frustration in her voice, right? And then they get all the way to the end. Well, with what shall I wet it? Well, with water, dear Henry. Well, with what shall I fetch it? With a bucket, dear Henry. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza. Right? That's the whole song. And it's, shows my mentality, I guess. I just love that song. It's right up there with Grandma's Feather Bed and, all the others. It's cyclical. Well, Our Daily Bread, May 18, 1994, kind of gave a story, related a story that's cyclical like that. It starts at the beginning and comes back, and I want to read this to you. Philip Parham tells a story of a rich industrialist who was disturbed to find a fisherman sitting lazily beside his boat. "Why aren't you out there fishing?" he asked. "Because I've caught enough fish today," said the fisherman. "Why don't you catch more fish than you need?" the rich man asked. "What would I do with them?" said the fisherman. "You could earn more money," came the impatient reply, "and buy a better boat so you could go deeper and catch more fish. You could purchase nylon nets, catch even more fish, and make more money. Soon you'd have a fleet of boats and be rich like me." End quote. Then the fisherman asked, "Then what would I do?" "You could sit down and enjoy life," said the industrialist. Quote, "What do you think I'm doing now?" The fisherman replied as he looked placidly out to sea. Sometimes we find ourselves, especially in today's culture, so inculcated with all of the things, weighed down with all the stuff that we have to do to get more stuff so that we can do what we want to do, that it keeps us from actually doing what we probably could have done in the first place. Right? Life is like that. Timothy is receiving this letter from his mentor, Paul. Paul is encouraging him as he leads the church of Ephesus. "Timothy, this is what you look for. This is how you guide your people. This is what a leader looks like. This is what you need to do as a pastor, so that they might be able to hold on to a relationship with the Lord that's meaningful. It has purpose. It's not just something they do on Sunday. It's not just a cultural thing. And all of those things are fine. There's nothing wrong with going to a place where, well, as the song said, people know your name, right? There's nothing wrong with going to a place where you can enjoy the time you have together and have these shared common values together. But there's something even more unique about the Church of Jesus Christ that is filled with a group of people who have a working, meaningful walk with God. True relationship. And so Timothy receives this letter, and Paul is encouraging him, this is how you pastor your church. There's a book out, it's called Simple Church. And the whole premise of this book is that in today's culture, we've made ministry so complex. There's something to be said about backing up from all of the stuff, all the things, all the possessions, all the busyness, and just enjoy the simplicity of your walk with God. In fact, he begins to say that here by way of giving some illustrations that I want us to focus on as we come to this passage in chapter 6. The passage of chapter 6, he communicates some things, and I'm going to relate them to you since I'm walking down this road of nostalgia. I'm going to give these things to you as three, what I hope, familiar phrases. And the first one is kind of a phrase that, I don't know, maybe somebody out there wiser than me penned, and that's probably why somehow we've come up with it in the counseling things that we've done. But my wife and I have oftentimes sat with couples or individuals that are going through difficult times or struggles or times of confusion or doubt or unsurety in their lives. And we've often said this to them, you know, sometimes you just have to get off the merry-go-round. The first one is that. Simply just get off the merry-go-round. And you could say it in a lot of ways, right? Get out of the hamster wheel. We've referred to it as the hamster wheel a lot in today's culture. It's get off the merry-go-round. Just, you know, the longer that you stay on there, the dizzier things get, the more blurry everything looks, the less you're really accomplishing anywhere, and you're certainly not going anywhere. And after a while, even the joy of being on there is gone because you just go round and round and round and round in life. Paul gives some very clear illustrations of that to Timothy here in the beginning of chapter 6. He says this in verse 1. Let as many bondservants as are under the yoke count their masters worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and his doctrine may not be blasphemed. And those who have believing masters, let them not despise them because they are brethren, but rather serve them because they are those who are benefited and they're believers and beloved. Wow, that was a paraphrase. And those who have believing masters, let them not despise them because they are brethren, but rather serve them because those who are benefited are believers and beloved. Teach and exhort these things. When he encourages Timothy to get off the merry-go-round of life, and we've all experienced it, whether it's our jobs, our children, our family life, our home life, the busyness of all the things we got to do. When we consider getting off the merry-go-round, the first thing that Paul encourages Timothy here with this is not to let your attitude embarrass your testimony. We are so caught up in the idea of those that have authority over us, whether they're bosses, teachers, older friends, older kids, older siblings, aunts and uncles, whatever it is, people that are in authority over us. We get so caught up in the idea that it's unfair, it's unjust, all of these other things, and we look so intently at the circumstances amidst which we find ourselves that we get our sight off of the true purpose. And Paul starts out for Timothy in verse 1 by saying, look, don't let your attitude embarrass your testimony. Look, as many bondservants as there are. Now, I want you to consider the idea of bondservants here. These bondservants were people who, in their lives, probably made some mistakes. It wasn't slavery like circles and circles. Is that which we find ourselves in the midst of continually and constantly striving. Striving for the next thing, the next better thing, the next place, the next job, the next home, the next person, the next the next promotion, the next position, the next possession, whatever it might be, and we just keep going and going and going. And instead of continuing to pursue what is for me, Paul says to Timothy, even if you're a bondservant, stop striving for your freedom and strive to serve. Stop striving for what you can earn back and strive to serve, because they're fellow believers. Be a servant. Look at verse 3. If anyone teaches otherwise and does not consent, now listen to the phrases here, to wholesome words, even the words of our Lord Jesus Christ, and to the doctrine which accords with godliness. That is in harmony with godliness. He doesn't, he's proud, verse 4, knowing nothing, but is obsessed with disputes and arguments over words from which come envy, strife, reviling, evil suspicions, useless wranglings of men of corrupt minds and destitute of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. From such withdraw yourself. Have you ever found yourselves reading the Apostle Paul and think, boy, I wish he'd just get to the point? Man, he is not afraid to be direct, is he? For anyone who teaches you that you have a right, in fact, it's understandable that you would feel that way towards your master. He is oppressing you. It's not fair that you owe him and now you have to do everything he says. It's not fair that he mistreats you. It's not fair that you have to serve him as a servant. Aren't you equal in Jesus Christ? Timothy says, look, within the culture that temptation is there. But he encourages him that you must live godly. You must rise above that. And for anyone who doesn't, look at that description. For anyone who doesn't, he is proud, knowing nothing. What does he mean by nothing? What he's saying is this: for anyone who's not willing to perceive this and understand this and couch it in terms of what Christ would say and what God would want for you, you don't even begin to understand the very foundation upon which your salvation is based. Jesus Christ served you in this way, even though his rightful position, his rightful glory, was the King of all kings and Lord of lords. If anyone doesn't teach, he's proud, he doesn't know anything, he's obsessed with all of this disputing and arguments over words that causes strife and reviling and suspicions and wranglings of corrupt minds, and it's destitute of truth. It has no value to satisfy. Have you ever noticed that? People that are gossipers, they're never satisfied. They never find fulfillment in that. They find it somehow a temporary ease that makes them feel better in the midst of some situation, but never is there satisfaction. Because there's always somebody out there that you feel is more superior to you. Look, if you want to live the simple life, if you want to understand the summation of life, what life adds up to, start by just getting off the merry-go-round. Don't do what others do. Don't have those kind of attitudes. Understand the main goal, that the name of God and his doctrine will be protected by the way you live. Get off the merry-go-round. The second one is this, and you've heard this before, it's in Scripture as well. You can't take it with you. Right? You can't take it with you. Listen, in terms of a holy life, D.L. Moody said this: a holy life will make the deepest impression. Lighthouses blow no horns. They just shine. Right? we come to this, Timothy is reminded by Paul, look, you can't take it with you. Now, verse 6, godliness with contentment is great gain. We've talked about this before. We quote this verse all the time. Godliness with contentment is great gain. These two are coupled together and cannot be compartmentalized. You can't be content without being godly, and you cannot be godly without being content. And we blow right past this truth so many times because we're so familiar with the verse, but I want you to understand how significant these are. Contentment, rehearsed contentment, aids godliness. Because it doesn't take my focus and redirect it towards the things that I find myself in the midst of, the circumstances. The more content that I am, the less burdened I am by my circumstances, the more opportunity I have to be godly in the first place. Why worry about what's going on around me? Know the power of contentment. It has the power to support a godly life. It's kind of like that fisherman in the beginning, right? Sitting next to the shore, enjoying the peace and quiet, and the wealthy man can't understand it. Why wouldn't you do this so that you can get rich? So you can do all of these things and have enough money to do what you're doing now. Contentment oftentimes can save us a lot of hurt. William Shakespeare said, and I'll change one word in this, if thou art rich, thou art poor. For like a donkey whose back with ingots bows, thou bearest thy heavy riches, but a journey, and only death unloads thee. Wow. Even Shakespeare. Right? If you're rich or poor. Because the more that you have, the more you carry. And really, life is just a journey that you have to carry all this stuff through. And at the end, the only thing that takes the load off is death itself. Godliness with contentment is great gain. Contentment is the very foundation upon which godliness is built. Contentment was the issue in the garden, right? Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Everything else is yours. You have the entire world. Every fruit that exists. Every plant that exists. Everything in the world that you could possibly eat is yours. Just don't eat this one. Be content with what God gives you. And as much as we'd like to beat up Adam and Eve, we probably would have made the same choice. In fact, I'm sure we would have. Know the power of contentment. Look at verse 7. For we brought nothing into this world. Here it is. It is certain we carry nothing out. We end like we started. I've said this quote before. I don't know. My wife and I always have a discussion about who really said it. Somebody that we knew. One of the preachers that we knew. All of my life, this preacher said, I spend my life just gaining things and establishing my life. And in my older ages, my older years, little by little, God takes it all back. Until we get to the place where there's nothing left but Him. And that is when God takes us home. Today in the Word, June 1990, said this, perhaps the most famous gold strike in American history occurred in January 1848, when a man named John Marshall found gold at Sutter's Mill in Northern California. The find set off a gold rush that reached a frenzied pitch and even attracted prospectors from as far away as Europe. But it ruined Marshall and John, driven into bankruptcy. Marshall died a drunk and penniless. We end like we start. And everything that we gain is not really ours to hold on to. It's just ours to use as a steward, being entrusted by God to use until He takes it back. You can't take it with you. We end like we started. Look at verse 8. Having food and clothing, with these we shall be content. Some would suggest really that the word these refers back grammatically to the words godliness and contentment. That's kind of interesting, because if I have food and I have clothing and I'm content, then that's supporting my pursuit in godliness. I don't know if grammatically I could verify that. Certainly in the original language, the construct of the sentence certainly points back to food and clothing. With these things I shall be content. You know, it's interesting. Simplicity truly is a gift. Not all of us are able to have it, to enjoy it. But there is something sweet about simplicity. Our daily bread, May 26, 1994. In the 5th century, a man named Irenaeus determined to live a holy life. So he abandoned the conforms of Egyptian society to follow an austere lifestyle in the desert. Yet whenever he visited the great city of Alexandria, he spent time wandering through its bazaars. Asked why, he explained that his heart rejoiced at the sight of all the things he didn't need. The sight of all the things he didn't need. Those of us who live in a society flooded with goods and gadgets need to ponder the example of that desert dweller. A typical supermarket in the United States in 1976 stocked 9,000 different items. Today, it's over 30,000. How many of them are absolutely essential? I remember coming down from Alaska, and things have even changed in Alaska since we lived up there. When we took the group of people back, some of the things that we had described they looked for and they didn't see. Now they have a super Walmart. Woo! Man, they've arrived. But back then there was like 2 grocery stores, unless I wanted to drive 3.5 hours to Anchorage. And between those 2 grocery stores, there really weren't much difference in the things they carried, just the difference in prices. And we would go to the grocery store to get some salad dressing. It wasn't that we hoped that we would have the right brand of ranch dressing. We would go to the grocery store hoping they had ranch dressing. Right? When we moved down here, the very first grocery store trip we had was to ShopRite in Glassboro. And they had little things on the wall that talk to you when you walk by. And I'm like, whoa, what is that? And we got to the salad dressing aisle, and my wife is poring over all the varieties. Not just the varieties of ranch dressing we had, but even the brands of the varieties of the dressing we had. And I'm not kidding you, after 25 minutes of standing in that aisle, I finally looked at Edie and said, honey, we live 2 blocks away. We'll come back if we don't like it. Just pick one. There comes a point in life where so many choices mount up that it robs us of the freedom we have to simply just live. And now we're bound by all the complexities of our choices and decisions instead of simply just resting in what God has given us. We must remember, if we're going to live the simple life, that we need not only to get off the merry-go-round, but we need to remember we can't take it with us. Let those things go, and remember that simplicity is a true gift. Simplicity is a gift. The last one, remember, love is blind. Love is blind. Look at verse 9. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. Those words, destruction and I can't even say it. Perdition. If I have to look at the text to actually pronounce those words. Honestly, in the Greek language, they're almost synonymous. The only difference between those two words is the idea on the first part of ruin, and the second part is waste. So let's put those words in. Rich men who fall into temptation and snare, and into many foolish and harmful lusts, which drown men in ruin and waste. Remember when we talked about the idea of the word love? Being so consumed by another you forget yourself. This is kind of the shoe on the other foot, isn't it? It's not saying that there's evil in wealth. In fact, tonight, if you come back, we're going to talk about the good things you can do with wealth. The Bible talks about that. We're not beating up people who have wealth, who have worked hard, who have what they have, and have worked hard to get it. That's not the point here. What is the point is the fact that there is a point at which you become so consumed with the possessions, so consumed with the wealth, so consumed with the job and the hierarchy at work and the position and the power and the influence that you're driven with, that you begin to drown in things that are temporary, things that will lead you to ruin and waste your efforts. That word drowning there is the idea of consuming. He's really saying, look, avoid drowning. What happens when you drown is you begin to panic in the water for whatever reason it is. Whether you can't swim or the water's too cold and your legs are cramping up, or you lose perspective of where you are. When I was a young married person, I took a friend and we went fishing, and we got onto the backside of this lake, and it got dark really fast, and we kind of lost track of time, and we could see down by the lake, but we couldn't walk the shoreline all the way back to the house because the woods got too thick and it was too rough along the shoreline. So we got back up in the woods and realized we couldn't see a thing in front of us. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face in the woods in Pennsylvania. Our wives, later on, we found out, were panicking and calling the rangers, and they're coming out looking for us. Yes, I was an idiot, okay? So we're out there, and I remember we got up into the woods. We kind of used the fishing poles as feelers so we didn't run smack dab into a tree, and kind of, felt back and forth so that we could make our way through the woods up the one side of the lake, and we got to this stream, and it was wide. It was almost as wide as this auditorium. And I remembered the stream from daylight and thinking to myself, well, I'm not going back. The only way to get here is to walk like we did. There was no roads, no trails. Walk like we did, or bring a boat. Tomorrow we'll come back with a canoe, we'll pick up our stuff. Let's leave it here and swim. I'm pitch black. And I never experienced this before. I got in the water. Some of you might be able to relate to a riptide and being caught in it. This must be what it feels like, because I remember getting into the water and we started swimming. And I had no depth perception because it was so dark. And I got partway across, and I started realizing to myself, I started getting this panicky feeling like, am I moving? If I'm not moving, what's the alternative? Drowning, right? And I remember starting to feel this little welling of panic in my heart. Maybe it was because my wife was angry at me at the time, and I didn't even know it, but I knew it. All right. So we're swimming, and eventually I calmed myself down, and I just kept swimming. We got to the other side, it was fine. And we got up to the road where there the ranger was with our wives in the pickup truck. I felt the panic again. No, I did. Oh, bless her heart, she lived with me for all these years now, 34 years. Oh. Right? That idea of drowning. You get into the water, and for whatever reason, you begin to panic. And the panic is this, that you know that once your head goes under that water, you only have the breath left in you, and that's it. And he's not saying, in fact, we're going to qualify in a minute, that wealth itself is wrong. But there comes a point where you're so much in the pursuit, you're on that hamster wheel, and you're becoming blinded by the love you have for your wealth. That you don't see what's going on around you, and you've lost that perception of where you are in life, and all of a sudden, you're surrounded by that which begins to drown you in the midst of it. How to teach your people. That is not what life is all about. Avoid drowning. Look at the beginning of verse 10. For the love of money, not money, but the love of it, love of money is the root of all kinds of evil, all sorts of evil. The pursuit of money drowns you, consumes you, surrounds you so much that you begin to do all sorts of evil things you never would have done before. He's saying to Timothy, look, teach them to be careful what you love. Love means you're so consumed with another, you forget yourself. And there's a pursuit of wealth that can cause you to forget who you are. Is it any wonder why Christ taught that it is hard for a rich man to enter into heaven? It's not about the wealth. It's about what it is a person counts on to get there. Remember, love is blind. Avoid drowning. Be careful what you love. And look at the last part of verse 10. It's the root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Here's the truth that hurts. Most, not all, most of our sorrows we cause. We just make it more complicated than it's meant to be. Don't make your own sorrows. Remember, love is blind. Be careful what you love and strive for. Avoid being drowned in it. Philip Yancey, in his book, Disappointment with God, said once, as an experiment, the great scientist Isaac Newton stared at the image of the sun reflected in a mirror. The brightness burned into his retina, and he suffered temporary blindness. Even after he hid for 3 days behind closed shutters, still the bright spot would not fade from his vision. He said, quote, "I used all means to divert my imagination from the sun," end quote. But he writes, "But if I thought upon him, I presently saw his picture, though I was in the dark." If he had stared a few minutes longer, Newton might very well have been permanently lost to all his vision. The chemical receptors that governs eyesight cannot withstand the full force of unfiltered sunlight. What we pursue in life has the very same power. The more that we stare at it, the more it's burned into the eyes of our soul. The question we have to ask ourselves is, what are we staring into? If we're staring into wealth, we'll drown. If we're staring into our possessions, we can't take it with us, we'll lose ourselves. But if we're staring into contentment and godliness, we'll have a life of simplicity that defies anything the world can create. Simple life. I don't think anybody that's over 20 years old in this room would not understand how sweet simple things can be. A waterfall, the beauty of a flower. I took a picture of a spider that made a web outside my office window. A close-up picture of the spider. And I've looked at that thing so many times, my wife thinks I'm crazy. There's such beauty and detail in that big fall spider. I felt better the other day because I saw somebody else post almost the exact same picture. Same spider, well, not the same spider, but you know what I mean, the same kind of spider, same details. The simple things in life. God has created such beauty that sometimes when we pursue the things we love in the circumstances around us rather than seeking God, we lose the beauty of the simplicity that He's already placed in our path. Paul says to Timothy, look, as you lead these people, teach them to get off the merry-go-round. Help them to understand that they can't take it with them. Make them know love is blind, and whatever you stare into most is going to blind you to anything else. Help them to ask this question. Let me ask this to you now. What do you stare into most? Because that's what you love. And you will become more blinded to everything else. Choose to love the right thing. Choose to love the God of creation. Blindness to the other things, it will consume you. But it makes life so much more simple. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for the simplicity of your word and your truth. The heartbeat of your faithful servants like Paul, who was willing, yes, at the prompting of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, to write these words, but sincerely in his heart to write so plainly and so adamantly about the follies of wealth's pursuit. Lord, help us to love the right things. Help us to stare into the wonder of your simplicity, your salvation through your Son, and lives lived according to your precepts. For only in the drowning of your truth will the complexities of this world and the rat race in which we live disappear, so that all we see left is the dot of your glory in the eyes of our lives. Lord, we commit ourselves to you again this day to lead simple